preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
These 6 lectures, we in B'nai B'rith are aware of the wonderful record that the Y has achieved in sponsoring programs of great Jewish content over these many years. The man that I referred to at the outset is the man with whom I spent a very, very pleasant hour with this evening, and I would ask him to take a bow. I should like Dr. William Kolodny to please rise and take a bow. Dr. Kolodny, where are you? Right in the back. A few days ago, a committee met with Dr. Hertzberg and decided how we were to conduct tonight's forum. And we decided that all I was to do was to make 1 or 2 very brief announcements and then introduce the moderator and the guest speaker. And we will do just that. Number 1, I should like to announce that the Adult Jewish Education Committee of B'nai B'rith is once again sponsoring its weekend, its Institute of Judaism at Spring Valley in New York. Those of you who are interested can get all the information you want by merely calling the Metropolitan Council at 20 West 40th Street. This weekend is to take place November the 17th, 18th, and 19th. And the lecturers will be Dr. Jaspe, who will discuss great Jewish thinkers and philosophers, and Dr. Honig, who will delve into and discuss the Talmud. Tonight, we are to have Dr. Arthur Hertzberg, who will act as the moderator for this lecture. Dr. Hertzberg is the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel in Englewood, New Jersey. He's a lecturer in Jewish history at Columbia University. He is the author of The Zionist Idea and a new book which just came out called Judaism. It is one in a new series of 6 books called Great Religions. Dr. Hertzberg will have control of the asking of the questions, of the recognizing of the people, and you will please be guided by his judgment. No question is to take more than 30 minutes. I should say 30 seconds. I probably thought that that's probably what some of you may do when you get up to ask a question. It's probably to feel that you'd like to make a statement of 30 minutes before asking the question. I mean 30 seconds. I'm sorry. That was a Freudian slip. The lecturer of the evening, ladies and gentlemen, is the world-renowned Maurice Samuel, author of The Gentleman and the Jew, The Professor and the Fossil, The Second Crucifixion, The World of Sholem Aleichem, many, many other books. His topic this evening: are we Jews by choice or necessity? Ladies and gentlemen, with a great deal of pride and pleasure that I present to you Mr. Samuel.
Mr. Chairman, Rabbi Hertzberg, ladies and gentlemen, When this subject was first presented to me, because I wasn't the one to choose it, I felt like rejecting it because, as I shall explain in a few minutes, I thought it incorrectly worded. And then it occurred to me that it was a very good wording from a certain point of view, namely the perplexity and the vagueness that many Jews are plunged into by this whole question of their Jewish identity. Are we Jews by choice or necessity? It represents, in its loose way, the hazy thinking and the rather painful emotions which accompany Jewish thought among our contemporaries. And the question is faulty for me because I don't know whether it means, is the Jewish people Jewish by choice or necessity? Is contemporaneous Jewry Jewish by choice or necessity? Does the individual ask of himself, am I Jewish by choice or necessity? And you have to go through a whole series of scrutinies in order to fix a certain degree of relevance between the lecture and the subject as it is here formulated. Jews by choice. Well, would you say that the Jews who were expelled from Spain and preferred exile to remaining on the spot were Jews by choice? It looks like it. They could, presumably, the 300,000 of them, at any rate that's the figure that's given traditionally, they could have remained in the country becoming Christians. So they were Jews by choice. They chose their destiny. They would take exile and remain Jews. But the Jews who remained behind had been Jews by necessity, apparently, because when the pressure was put on, they became Christians. But did they? We know that a very large number of them continued to secrete, as it were, their Jewish identity, so that for generations, even down till this time, traces of their Judaism can be found among them, among the Marranos. So it looks as though they were Jews by choice also, although in an inferior degree. It looks as though once a pattern of consciousness is fixed in a group or is fixed in an individual, that individual has no choice, within limits, has no choice but to retain it, unless he is to do psychological violence to himself. Let us take extreme cases, however. It's very obvious that the martyrs in the time of Hadrian, the 10 famous martyrs as they are enumerated in the tradition, were Jews by choice. They would either be Jews or they would be dead. That is to say, life had no meaning for them unless they could practice their Judaism. There's an absolute extreme. Or you can go to another extreme. Jews of ancient times, let us say, also in the time of the Roman governorship of ancient Israel, or to go further back than that, in the time of the Maccabees, or to come forward into our own time, there are individual Jews who can manage to slide out from under. And they do it. They manage. Of those, you would say that they are goyim by choice. If you look at the picture statistically in modern times, is the Jewish people as we know it, this general group Is it Jewish by choice or necessity? Again, we are faced with these distinctions which point to the irrelevance of this formulation. Supposing all the Jews of New York were today to be seized by an impulse to disappear from the Jewish roster. And supposing all the Cohens changed their names to McCarthy and all the Finkelsteins to Van Kelstein, and there was an immense gap in the telephone book. You know, the Cohens occupy, I think, 17 pages in the New York telephone book, and something like 12 in the Brooklyn telephone book. They aren't there anymore. Finkelsteins aren't there anymore. The Levis, the Samuels. And there would be a hue and cry. What happened to them? And research, several PhDs having been earned by that means, research would disclose that they've disappeared into certain groups taking these and these names. Could those Jews, could the mass of Jews of New York disappear? They couldn't. Theodor Herzl at one time, this was more than half a century ago and before he became a convinced and prophetic Zionist, Theodor Herzl once contemplated the idea of the Jews en masse, the Jews of Vienna, going to the Stephanskirche, the St. Stephen's Cathedral, and converting to Catholicism in order to solve the Jewish question. And then on reflection, he came to the conclusion that all that they would do is change their name from Zaujuden, which means pig Jews, to pig Christian Jews. Well, there you would say Jews are Jews by necessity. They just can't get out of it. Let me reformulate the question so as to approach it with a little more analytical possibility. I would say the real question is, are we Jews by inner necessity or Jews by outer necessity? In other words, is our identity continuously imposed upon us by the hostility of the outside world? Or do we, in one fashion or another, to one degree or another, affirm that we are Jews? And there may be an interplay between the two. There may be compulsion from the outside and at the same time an affirmation from within. The history of the Jewish people from biblical times down to the latest consists of an alternation of repudiation and acceptance. This is most evident in the biblical history up to the time when biblical history, properly speaking, ends, namely the second book of Kings. That every so often the Jews would be extremely attached to their tradition and to their God. Every so often they would repudiate the tradition and the God, and there would be a sort of rhythm in it. And in that alternation, you can't tell what was inner compulsion and what was external compulsion. It looks as though there was, even in those days, a mixture of the two. There was a longing to be rid of this burden of identity which brought with it so many disabilities and discomforts. At the same time, there was a hankering after it. This is reflected, even among very good Jews nowadays. I remember the story that was current among very good Jews, telling of one that was going to Palestine. This was years and years ago. It was called Palestine then. And a friend of his said, "You really going to Palestine?" He said, "Yeah." "Are you going to be near Mount Sinai?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Wait a minute." And he went to the shul, he brought a Sefer Torah, he said, "Look, give this back, will you please? I've had enough of it." It's a kind of story that's current among Jews who are really attached to Judaism. There is this, what they call in the now familiarized language, this ambivalence among Jews. But this is a feature of personality anywhere. Are we what we are as individuals anywhere, by choice or by necessity? We're born in certain circumstances. We grow up into certain patterns. Did we choose them? And when we grow up, are we free to repudiate them? Can we really make a complete revolution and become somebody else? It is a question of degree. And in this problem of accepting one's destiny or of repudiating it, there are two levels. One is the creative level, and one is the destructive level. I can imagine a Jew, a Christian, anybody else, brought up in a certain pattern, revolting against that pattern on grounds which are admirable, on grounds which are acceptable even to those who are being repudiated. One would say of him, I don't agree with you, but I can see there is nobility in what you intend. A man repudiates the Jewish people because he says the time has come to obliterate all differences between all peoples. I don't want to be labeled as this or that. It is admirable when it's pure. When the man doesn't substitute for the parochialism, as he conceives it to be, of the Jewish identity, the parochialism of something else. In other words, if he isn't a fake revolutionary. These cases are comparatively rare. Nobility is comparatively rare. On another level, a man may repudiate his Judaism because he simply hasn't got any character at all. He hasn't the strength to stand up to the world. He hasn't the content. He hasn't the training. And here I'm not speaking as one who accuses. I'm not taking the role of the Satan McCatrig. It is a man who simply is driftwood. He is material which is molded by immediate circumstance, and there wasn't instilled into him, or he hadn't the capacity to receive the material of an identity. This problem of Jews by choice or necessity keeps on haunting us and finds its way into expression so frequently among modern Jewish writers. And as a rule, it is on the second level that I mentioned. And often it is mixed with a queer kind of vain longing, a nostalgia which contradicts it. Edna Ferber, for example, wrote a book called A Peculiar Treasure, in which she affirmed her pride in being Jewish. She writes in the introduction, I should like to write in this book about being a Jew. All my life I have been inordinately proud of being a Jew. Sounds fine. Here is the affirmative attitude. But then she goes on to say, a few pages later, it has always been my contention that the Jew, left in peace for 200 years throughout the world, would lose his aggressiveness, his tenacity, and neurotic ambition, would be completely absorbed and would vanish as a type from the face of the earth. Thus, for centuries, we have been saved from complete absorption or utter oblivion by such fanatics, megalomaniacs, as a Pharaoh, a Hitler, an Ivan of Russia, or a Philip of France, or an Edward I of England. Now, what is she saying? She says, in the first place, I'm proud to be a Jew. In the second place, she says, if the going would leave us alone, I'd stop being a Jew. This is exactly what Ilya Ehrenburg said only a few days ago. As long as there is an anti-Semite, I am a Jew. And when there are no anti-Semites, I won't be a Jew. I mean, at least that is the implication. What is the meaning of such an attitude? Does it actually imply a complete emptiness and repudiation? I don't know. I only know that very often a weariness either of the person with his personality, of the Jew with his Jewishness, which is another way of putting it, can overcome somebody. And if this were the case with the Jewish people as a whole, it couldn't have survived. Here we have a 2,000-year history of continuous identification in various places, under various languages, under various pressures, 2,000 years of continuous identification, which couldn't have persisted if there had been, all the way through, nothing but this feeling of, I am a Jew because they won't let me become a goy. Because the Jew who says, I am a Jew only because they won't let me become a goy, doesn't actually realize that there is within him an affirmative potential. He is ascribing his personality to somebody else's wish. There used to be a famous anti-Semitic mayor of Vienna called Lüger. This was in the 1890s. And strangely enough, he had Jews among his friends. And when they asked him, how is that possible, his answer was, Wer Jude ist, das bestimme ich. I'm the one who decides who's a Jew. So that for Jews living under this aspect of Judaism, it meant that their identity was in the hands of somebody else. If you said you're a Jew, he was a Jew. If you said you're not a Jew, you're not a Jew. Now, with this sort of vagueness of identity, you could not have had continuation for 2,000 years. And least of all could you have had, at the end of 2,000 years, those evidences of vitality which today astonish both the Jewish and the non-Jewish world with regard to the Jewish people. Now, the attitude I speak of in Edna Ferber is reproduced again in that famous, and to me, from the Jewish point of view, rather infamous novel, Dr. Zhivago, in which those of you who have read the book will remember, there's a very painful scene when Zhivago and his Jewish friend David are watching a Cossack tormenting an old Jew. And when they have left the scene, Yuri, who is Dr. Zhivago really, Yuri bursts out, what use is it to anyone, this involuntary martyrdom? Whom does it profit? For what purpose are those innocent old men and women and children, all those subtle, kind, humane people, mocked and beaten up throughout the centuries? And why is it that all these literary friends of the people, it means Zionists, nationalists, rabbis, Jewish teachers, why is it that all these literary friends of the people of all nations are so untalented? Why don't the intellectuals of the Jewish people ever go beyond the facile Weltschmerz? Why have they not, even at the risk of bursting like boilers with the pressure of their duty, disband this army which keeps on fighting and being massacred, nobody knows for what? Why don't they say to them, come to your senses, stop, don't hold on to your identity, don't stick together, disperse. Now this is Zhivago's view as expressed through the mouthpiece of Yuri, his own character. Why do you hold on to your identity? Now why does a person hold on to his identity? What has a person got beside his identity? Who's going to give him an identity if he himself doesn't affirm one? And this is what confronts us today, the degree to which we shall turn world pressure against us into an affirmation, and the degree to which we will draw on knowledge and experience out of the past in order to declare to the world, I will not yield my identity under pressure or under duress. This is the one thing that a human being has that is actually himself. When I consider, for example, what happened in the last 20-odd years to the Jewish people, all of this agonizing self-scrutiny becomes very poignant. You had in Europe 6 million Jews who have been destroyed. How many of those Jews wanted to be Jewish? And to what degree? It's quite possible that a very perceptible minority would have said, we prefer to be killed rather than declare ourselves non-Jews. Possible? No, it's probable. There must have been a number like that. But of the vast majority, one would say that they went to their death just wondering what it was for, not knowing that willy-nilly, against all their inclinations, they were being used as illustrations of martyrdom. There is such a thing as involuntary martyrdom. And in my opinion, it should rank with voluntary martyrdom, perhaps even higher. You take a man, you say, repudiate your identity or we'll kill you. And he says, I won't do it. And you say, there is the basic material of human character. You take another man and you say, call yourself Jew or Gentile, it makes no difference to me. I'm going to kill you because you're a Jew. There's something more pathetic about that man. There's something in him which points to the inevitability of character as the affirmation of the individual. He dies not knowing why. He dies because there is such a thing as character in the world. Now, when I consider what happened to the Jews in these last 20 years, when I consider that the large majority of the Jews of Europe who fell to Hitler were actually involuntary martyrs, and when I consider the reaction in the rest of world Jewry, I am deeply moved by the affirmation that there is among Jews. I would have thought, or one would have thought, not I would have thought, that after what happened to those millions of Jews, the remainder of world Jewry, the 10, 11 million left alive, would do one of two things. Either say, let's get out if we can, a much larger rate of assimilation than we have today, or else, not being able to escape, assimilation en masse being denied to it, it would become corrupt with a cynicism and a loathing of the human species such as no other people has manifested. In other words, it would have developed exactly the character which has been attributed to it by anti-Semites as far back as Tacitus. There's a famous passage in Tacitus, the Roman historian, in which he says that the Jewish people is the enemy of all mankind, enemy of the gods and enemy of all human beings. In fact, all of the later Roman writers after the Augustan period looked upon the Jews as some sort of deeply corrupted and vicious species to which no mercy should, theoretically at least, be given. And the Jews should, by all psychological principles, have become exactly that after what happened in the Hitler time. I could imagine millions of Jews in America saying, so that's what they do to us. Well, all right, they won't let us become Gentiles, they won't let us assimilate. Well, let's make a conspiracy among ourselves. Let's hate the human species. Let's oppose anything that's good for the human species. Let's despise all goyim. And you could imagine a corruption, a vindictiveness creeping into the Jewish people, which would make all creative activity impossible. But it didn't happen. I don't think you will find among Jews, even with regard to an Eichmann, that kind of deep-rooted, that organic loathing that one would expect. I was in Israel. I was at the Eichmann trial. I spoke with Israelis. They looked upon the man certainly with anger. But you don't find among them, and you don't find among Jews here, that decadence of the moral spirit to which that should have led. And so you find the Jews now in the 7th decade, in the 6th and 7th decades of the 20th century, creative and active and optimistic and looking forward to a role in the world of tomorrow. This doesn't bespeak being Jewish under necessity. This is not the response of somebody under the goad or under the lash. This is something endemic, comes from within. It belongs to this tradition. How this tradition has perpetuated itself is quite another story. But it's there. You find these people building a homeland which is in the forefront of the world's progressive peoples. You find these people here in America concerned with welfare, with world problems, still moved by the ancient Jewish tradition of some sort of mission. It doesn't matter whether you take the Tanakh literally, as fundamentalist Jews do, or whether, as most or many modern Jews do, you look upon it as a mixture of legend, myth, and history. It doesn't matter whether you think of Abraham as an individual or as an eponym. What is important is that the Jews throughout many, many centuries projected back upon their beginnings this conception of their birth, namely that in thy name shall the peoples of the earth bless themselves. And throughout their conscious and recorded history, as distinguished from the, you might call the myth, the unconscious or the dream history of a people, throughout their recorded and conscious history, Jews have wanted to play an affirmative role in the world, even during the Middle Ages, when they were repressed, cut off from the world. They tried to burst out of the limitations imposed on them, and names among them circulated throughout the world, sometimes without recognition. And Ibn Gabirol, for example, would deeply influence the church under the name of some Arab thinker, Avicenna Hebron. A Maimonides would be recognized. And later on, a Spinoza, who drew his original philosophy from a Jew, Chasdai ibn Kreskas, would move the world. Today, for example, you find that a movement which was confined within the limits of ghetto Jewish life, the Hasidic movement, is producing an effect in the outside world. Hasidism. It was such a Hamish thing. It was ours. What do the Goyim know about it? What can a Goy find in Hasidism? And yet you discover Hasidism, born within the limits of the ghetto, does affect the outside world, and it's even being discussed in all the latest, most fashionable terminology of philosophy. We were always conscious of playing a role. And therefore, if you look at the Jewish people as a historic identity, to question whether it was necessity or choice is not to know what took place in the Jewish people. This is, in fact, the thesis of Toynbee. When he calls the Jews, among others, a fossil people, he means that they've gone on existing because they couldn't die. They were a petrifaction which no waters could dissolve and which the outside world couldn't hammer into dust. Just went on. And he proves this thesis by omitting from his 12-volume, 13-volume, 14-volume, it'll go on forever because that man will never die. He goes on never mentioning that there was a Talmud, that there was a Midrash, that there was a Maimonides, an Ibn Gabirol, a Spinoza. Those names don't occur in his book. And there are Jews who have that feeling infected from the outside world. We are Jews by necessity because we can't die. The world won't let us, or we don't know how. We've lost the trick of dying, and we don't know how to live. Nicht gelebt und nicht gestorben. Now, this is false, because there was productivity in the Jewish people all the time, and the outside world benefited by it. So that when you ask yourself this question statistically about the Jewish people, or historically, Jews by necessity or by choice, at least say they wanted to, they had the material, there was the will, and there was an everlasting outbreak, volcanic outbreak of activity, now culminating in the beginnings of a reawakening here, and in more than the beginnings of a Jewish contribution to the world in Israel. Necessity or choice, whatever degrees you attribute to each of these classifications, at least know that in the majority of circumstances, the Jew wanted it, the Jew did it, the Jew went on creating and still goes on creating.
May I begin, of course, by thanking Mr. Samuel on behalf of all of us for a very eloquent and moving address. I would like to say a word about procedure. What we are going to do tonight is that I'm going to needle him a little bit for 10 or 15 minutes, ask him a few questions, and then after we've really bludgeoned each other a little, I will then be Irish about it. You know that old Irish story where two Irishmen are fighting in a bar, and in walks a third one, and he says to Pat and Mike, "Is this a private fight, or can anybody join?" We'll start with a bit of a private fight. Let me, however, say one thing by way of introduction. My first experience of Mr. Samuel, he'll forgive me for reminiscing, was when he was a bit younger and I was a bit younger. And he used to come in the 30s very often to Baltimore, especially to the platform of Chizuk Amunah. Remember when old Adolf Koblenz used to have you there at least once a year? And I used to sit in the third gallery of Chizuk Amunah and listen to him thunder at us and talk to us of all of our Jewish derelictions and all of the things that were wrong with us. This was, of course, the first Isaiah. And tonight I found myself listening quite surprisingly, I must say, not only to the second Isaiah, the Isaiah which begins with Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami, comfort ye, my people, but I'm afraid that I was perhaps listening in advance to a bit of my own biography, because I am precisely that much younger today, which makes me about the age that he was when I first heard him in Baltimore. And I am not the optimist that Mr. Samuel is at all about our American Jewish creativity, our Israeli Jewish creativity. I do not deduce, as he does, that all is well. I think that it is far from well in this affirmation of our Jewish identity. This is the perspective from which I'm going to ask several questions. Now, I quite agree. Am I? Oh, good. I quite agree with Mr. Samuel. that the Jews as a whole could not disappear. But I do not think that it is true, that it is historically true, that it is true to the present, that individual Jews cannot disappear. There was an English Jew who had a granddaughter who died a while ago as part of royalty. Her name was Lady Mountbatten. I'm telling English stories tonight because Mr. Samuel is a Mancunian, which means he's from Manchester. There's a little Jewish girl named Edith Stein, a pianist, who is now married to the Earl of Harewood, first cousin to the Queen. She was brought over 15 years or so ago to England by the British equivalent of our Joint Distribution Committee. I know the people who received her upon arrival. Her musical interests brought her into contact with the fine musician who is the first cousin to the Queen. She was married in Westminster Abbey. I happened to be in London when it was taking place, rode in the royal coach to the Chasana, and I am quite convinced that she has disappeared as a Jew. For that matter, there was in New York a revolutionary rabbi named Gershom Mendes Seixas, and B'nai B'rith is chief among the organizations which salams to his memory. Go to any Americanism program of any B'nai B'rith lodge, and after you mention Chaim Solomon, you'll get to Seixas, the fellow who prayed at the inauguration of President Washington. How many times have you heard about him? Well, every time a Seixas dies, he dies as an Episcopalian. There's perhaps one branch of the family left who are still Jews, and they are not Jews who happen to be Episcopalians. It is true that the body of the Jewish people is not in any great danger of disappearance. But I would like to ask Mr. Samuel whether that really solves the problem of your grandchildren and mine, who continue to have the option, personally, of disappearing. Are we, because the people as a whole will not disappear, are we safe in our individual lives? And I must confess that I worry rather more often about whether my great-grandchildren will still say a little Kaddish for poor old Zeta than I worry about the destiny of the Jewish people. And so let me ask him a very old-fashioned question, which is, how sure are you and I that we're going to have Yiddish Kaddish? This is question number one.
There's enough in that question to keep me going for the next 2 hours, but I'll spare you. Now, the reason that I sound optimistic to the rabbi, I think, is the difference in our years. I've been watching American Jewry for 50 years, pretty nearly. 1914 I came to this country, it's now 1961. So it's almost half a century. Now, Rabbi Hertzberg hasn't got this perspective, at least not in as a result of immediate observation. If he only could feel what I saw in American Jewry, or what I felt in American Jewry in 1914, 15, 16, when you couldn't have got an audience like this for a subject like this, because English-speaking people, and a lot of young people here I notice, weren't interested, didn't want to know. If you could only remember what it was like then today, bad as it is, and I confess that it's bad, I'm not satisfied any more than he is, there's been a marvelous transformation. Of course, there are people who say, and there's a curiously Jewish way of saying it, they say the reason the Jews are turning religious now is because the Goyim are turning religious. Jews are going to the suburbs, Goyim are going to the suburbs, the Goyim are religious, the Jews are religious, so when the Goyim will stop being religious, the Jews will stop being religious, which proves that Jews becoming religious today are really assimilating. That's a piece of Talmudic wisdom, and when you point to your left, here's my left ear over here. Now the fact is that what is taking place in America today, this resurgence, call it if you like, it is more sociological than religious, and it's perfectly true, these are valid observations. This is the matrix within which a consciousness can be reborn. Now, I understand every person is worried about his own progeny of the next or the subsequent generation. Well, there's no guarantee. Individual Jews do disappear, and it's a phenomenon, Rabbi, which is observable everywhere. Every strong people in the world sends out at every generation a number of its sons and daughters to be absorbed by other peoples. The French, the English, the Italians have sent into the New World large numbers of their sons and daughters who are lost to them. These are the emigrants. We have emigrants. We've always had them. And Rabbi Hertzberg, who certainly knows his Jewish history, will tell you that even in the Middle Ages, when we were supposed to have lived a monolithic life and all Jews were faithful, well, that's a romantic misrepresentation. There were Jews who in those days in groups and individually apostatized. We can afford it. I'd rather not spend it, but we can afford it. We have gone on in this way, why, ever since the very beginning. Jews have apostatized. I happen to be, and I hope that the rabbi will also be in that position, I happen to be secure with my grandchildren. After that, I'm not responsible. I mean, I can see ahead until the children of the children, but after that, God's responsible. I've been lucky, let us say. I've had very fortunate offspring. Others haven't. But if the rabbi tells us that the body of the Jewish people is sound, then we have to say, I will try to join the body of the Jewish people, because in the other direction lies a dishonor and a malaise and a discomfort for which there is no reward in acceptable terms. The people as a whole is sound, much sounder than it was 40, 50 years ago. And this is what has to comfort us. I don't want to seem to become a sort of doting Pollyanna about the Jews. But the perspective that I've got after all these years gives me a marvelous feeling. Some people joined movements like the communist movement, that movement, and they have many bitter things to regret. I can't regret having gone in for Jewish life. I was once tempted to leave the Jewish world. The rewards elsewhere were more tempting. The possibilities of both material and psychological rewards were brighter. But I wouldn't have found anywhere else what I do find today. I didn't waste my life. Nobody who works within the confines of the Jewish people for its continuity wastes his life. What's the next question, Rabbi?
Since we want to get to the floor fairly rapidly, I'm going to ask one more question, and I'll ask it in the round. I am still not at all convinced that we are as well off as Mr. Samuel would have me believe we are. Now, I agree with something he said. I suspect that we are probably the only two positive Jews in America who are not at all upset by the famous commentary symposium, because as I read it, I remembered that in the 1920s in the Farverts, I could, in any 6 issues, have read a rather more nasty rundown on what is going on in Jewish life. I remembered that it wasn't even this good among our intellectuals quite a while ago. It is nonetheless true that there is one issue that we tend to fudge and to obscure, and which Mr. Samuel managed to negotiate very brilliantly with the skill that only he possesses, which seems to me to be a yawning chasm. Mr. Samuel managed to say, remember, those of you who were listening to him with the great care to which you always listen to a man of his eminence, Mr. Samuel managed to say, quite innocently, about the Bible, it does not matter whether you take it in fundamentalist fashion or whether you take it as the reflection of the highest ideals of the Jewish group, which is really his way of saying what Zangwill once said. It doesn't matter whether the Jews are a chosen people, they are certainly a choosing people. This is all very nice, but the trouble with it is that granting that there were plenty of Mishamodim in the Middle Ages. Abner of Burgos was a rabbi, and he turned up after a while. He started as the rabbi of Burgos and turned up after he became a Mishamad as the anti-Semitic bishop of Burgos. And he is not, he is known in history as Pablo de Santa Maria, and he is not a unique phenomenon. We can over-romanticize, by the way, even the East European Jewish past. Read somebody like Yitzchak Bashevis Zinger, Satan in Gorey, which is now, of course, in English, Satan in Gorey, and you will discover that they knew about all kinds of things, including incest, in the 17th century. They called it false messianism. I know all this. It is nonetheless true that Jewish survival for 18 centuries was guaranteed not by Jewish identity and not really by the outside world, but as we are in agreement around this table tonight, by the fact that the Jews affirmed themselves. But they didn't affirm their identity, and they didn't affirm the nobility of their choices. They didn't affirm the fact that they were a great creative people and all the rest of it. What they affirmed was a very specific covenant relationship between the Jews and the living God who had chosen them. Now, ever since the 18th century happened to us, and the beginning of the 19th century, Jews have stopped really, in their overwhelming majority, affirming this at all. What they have been affirming at most is that the Jews are a wonderfully creative people with high ideals and great values, and a mission to continue to be bright, useful, and creative. Now, I submit that this is very nice, so long as you're am Tatens a Kind. Maurice Samuel is, and so am I. Wir sind aufgewachsen ergens bei Taten in Heus. Even though, unfortunately, he grew up in Romania and we Galicianer don't. We're not really, we have our difficulties with Romania. Nonetheless, this is an East European cheshbon. It is nonetheless true that by the time you get some Zaytens Einiklach, when you get into the third generation, when you get into the bright-young sophomores in Harvard, and they start asking you such klutzkashes as, why are you so sure that your morality is superior to John Dewey's morality? Or, to put it in a more highfalutin way, when the first agnostic Jew who asserted Jewish survival seriously, Achad Ha'am, tried to write a book on the superiority of Jewish ethics to non-Jewish ethics, tried to validate the importance in the scheme of value of Jewish survival, he spent his whole life preparing himself to write the book, and it failed. Now, Mr. Samuel has written the book. He wrote it in a very famous one, which he might even remember, The Gentleman and the Jew, in which he tried to point out the difference between the values of the Jew and the values which are inherent in Christianity. Now, quite apart from the fact that obviously, for the sake of making a point, he exaggerated, I am not at all convinced that if everything he wrote in that book were absolutely so and down the line, that this as a system of value guarantees the desire of Jews to continue to live on. Now, I'll wind up this very lengthy counter-comment, just to start the debate, by saying one more thing. It is simply true that every Jewish community which has lived 4 generations in political and intellectual emancipation has turned up with a rate of defection that approaches 50%. Let me give you the evidence. Budapest before Hitler marched in Budapest, 4 out of 10 of every Jew getting married was marrying out. In Vienna, in 1936, either 37 or 43%. Let's settle for the lower figure. But the lower figure is definitely the very least it could have been. 37% of all Jews being married were marrying out. And this had nothing to do yet with Hitler. I know the defense. There was a rate of intermarriage, by the way, in Warsaw. Among those who wrote down Polish as their mother tongue, there was a rate of intermarriage in Warsaw in the 1920s, approaching 30%. Now, we comfort ourselves here in America with the notion that the rate of intermarriage is at most 1 in 11. You've heard that said. I've used the argument myself. The rate of intermarriage is 1 in 11. This is to kid oneself. When you say it is 1 in 11, you are saying that of all Jews presently married, 8 or 9% are married to people who are not born Jews. But when you break this figure down in terms of those Jews who got married in the last 5 years, and there are 2 unpublished studies which have broken it down, you arrive at something up between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4. 1 in 5 to 1 in 4. Now, I submit that it is too easy to say, shalom, shalom, there is peace. It is easy, and there are signs of it. Violent atheism is no longer fashionable. Anti-Zionism is less and less fashionable. Yom Kippur balls are less and less fashionable. There is a sense of being willing to discuss Jewish identity and Jewish values without quite the venom that used to go into the violence of 40 years ago. This is all very true. But when an Eric Goldman can tell me on a television program a couple of months ago, I've already got dumb Jews in Princeton, which means, translated into the language of sociology, that if our parents had a drive towards education, that drive is lessening among those who are acculturated. If Jews are now beginning to flunk out of college about as rapidly and in the same proportion as their non-Jewish friends, if there is less of a Jewish influence, not more of one, in the forward-looking movements, whether one accepts them or not, and I am, by the way, increasingly a reactionary. I do not accept them very much. I'm becoming more and more of an American patriot under the pressure of contemporary events. But whatever we used to identify with Jewish zeal, with Jewish forward-lookingness, that too is evaporating. And intermarriage is rising, and it is rising crucially. And I submit to conclude that to the present, speaking from the historical perspective, the 4th generation of every Jewish community that I know anything about, from France, east and west, in the 4th generation, it has produced, at most, an Alfred Dreyfus, someone to suffer for being a Jew who really doesn't quite know what to do with it. This, I think, is the challenge of the American Jewish community, to break the pattern and to create creative Jewish life. And so I think that it is a question and a challenge, not an achievement. And it is to these reflections that I hope Mr. Samuel will now address himself and demolish them, and then we'll turn the discussion over to the floor.
Rabbi, what can I do if you don't feel well this evening? I've told you what I feel. You've told me what you feel. Eiches paskuden auf dem Herzen. I'm feeling all right. What are we going to do? Produce statistics? You're really going to prove that we're going to the dogs? Am I going to prove that all is well and all is fortunate? I can only tell you that I've been going around for a long, long time, and I'm not despairing. I'm not going to say that every day I dance a jig to celebrate the fidelity and the conformity of the Jews to the old patterns. I can't do that. But you know, when I came to this country at the age of 19, I mentioned it, I got here in 1914, everybody was talking the way you do. At least the way you're talking tonight. I'm sure on other evenings you talk otherwise, because we all have our moods, I know. At least I don't get those moods very often, I must say. When I got here in 1914, American-born young people were talking that way. All said, what are you talking about? By the year 1950, you know how far off that looked, the year 1950, in 1914? Much further off than the year 2100 looks now. It loomed far away beyond the confines of the Milky Way. By 1950, you'll have no more synagogues in America. You'll have no more yeshivas. You'll have no more Jewish centers. It'll all be gone. It's the melting pot. Those of you who are my contemporaries, and there can't be many here, those of you who have read about the past will remember that this was the current phrase in those days. Well, you say exactly what they used to say to me. Now, You'll live much longer than I. I hope so, anyhow. You deserve to. But you're going to find out when you reach my age, and excuse me for pulling rank on you, Rabbi, that you'll get no satisfaction afterwards. I go around nowadays and I meet people that I knew 40, 45 years ago. And when they spoke in this vein about dissolving jury in the melting pot. And I asked them, tell me, what Hebrew school is your grandchild going to? Oh, 85th Street. I said, what do you mean 85th Street? There wasn't going to be any. You said that. I said, who, me? I tell you, there's no satisfaction in growing old. People just don't admit what they said. It's like looking lahavdil for Nazis in Germany. Now, when you've lived through that epoch, you'll take the statistics. They were worse in those days. The statistics were more discouraging in those days than they are now. I can't go into analysis. I'm not a demographer. But even taking the figures that you give, there has been such a falsification of demographic expectation. For example, 30 years ago, Jews were barely reproducing themselves. It was 2 to a family, which doesn't allow for wear and tear. Now, today it is 2.5 to a family. That's the latest I've got, which gives you an edge. Now, if you've got 2.5 as against 2, you can afford 20% loss. Now, I don't know whether this is absolutely, I don't know whether this is absolutely accurate, but we can't base this, we can't let ourselves be depressed by figures. If we are going to survive, it will be by the existence of a feeling that we are surviving. And we might do it even in the face of adverse demographic figures. Because the principal element in the survival of a culture or of a people is its vitality, its inner vitality. And if you were to tell me that in the year 2000 or the year 2020, there will only be 2 million Jews in America, 2.5 million Jews, and I could feel that among them 1 million are good Jews, I wouldn't despair at all. I would say that is one of the vicissitudes in the history of a people. In the beginning of the 19th century, say around the year 1800, Jewish historians tell us the Jews numbered about 3 million. There was a time in the Middle Ages when we probably numbered not more than 1 million. These are the ups and downs. I'm not offering this as a guarantee that we're going to live forever. I'm merely saying that to permit oneself to be unduly swayed by the immediate circumstances is not to see the significance of this immense trajectory of Jewish history, this 2,500-year trajectory, which cannot be subsumed in the terminology of an immediate experience, which cannot be interpreted as the consequence of a given set of circumstances. And lest you accuse me of using the immediate set of circumstances myself, let me say that the reason I am moved by this resurgence in American Jewry, take it for what you will, the reason I'm moved by it is because it's happened before. There was a time in Babylonian Jewry when Judaism was at a lower ebb, but it rose. Russian Jewry began with next to nothing. It rose. Spanish Jewry, similarly. We're going through the same cycle, and it isn't only on this circumstance that I base my feeling. Let's not call it optimism versus pessimism. Rabbi Hertzberg is not a pessimist, and I am not a Pollyanna. Let me say that whatever the mood of the moment is, if you stand back a little bit and look at this enormous phenomenon of the Jewish people, you are dissuaded from the mood of the moment, pessimistic or optimistic. It is too gigantic a phenomenon to deal with in, what shall I say, in journalistic terms. One can speak only in enormous historical perspectives in order to get at the reality.
At this point, I'm really beginning to wish that it were a private fight. But I suppose that we'll continue this anon. Let me now turn to the floor and start, if I can look over the glare of these lights, start recognizing some questions. Let me say, and I am not going to be guilty of any Freudian slips of the tongue, that I'm going to be, having been a very prolix debater, I'm going to be a very ruthless chairman. And 30 seconds is the time that is allotted for questions or comments directed at Mr. Samuel. The lady over on the side there. No. No. That mean we're not, ma'am.
We have to understand how to deal with it, what it is, what we can do about it, and what to do generally in this revolutionary civil rights period.
You can't do very much about anti-Semitism. That's the first thing that you have to resign yourself to. You do what you can. You have certain activities. You act through the law. You have certain public relations agencies. These are necessary. But anti-Semitism is not in our control. It is a Christian phenomenon. We must cooperate with Christians in trying to diminish the spread of anti-Semitism, but don't get into the attitude that anything we can do changes the complexion of the world, because that would be actually accepting the anti-Semitic position that we control world opinion. We are not the controllers of world opinion, and anti-Semitism is something which is rooted in the folklore of Christian civilization, which we do not control. Don't get panicky about these things. And the most important thing of all is don't let yourself be infected by anti-Semitism yourself. I want to be very cautious about this. Don't get the idea that Jews are responsible for anti-Semitism, even to the extent that by neglect they are permitting it to spread. There are Jews who are anti-Semitic in an indirect and yet a specific way. You know the kind of Jew who points to another Jew and says, "You see that kind of Jew? That's the kind of Jew that causes anti-Semitism." The Jew who says that is anti-Semitic, because anti-Semitism is not caused by the behavior of Jews. I'll admit there are nasty Jews, there are mean Jews, there are Jews who consume their soup with conspicuous audibility in restaurants. There are Jews who wear loud ties. There are Jews who do not always behave with the dignity and decorum of an American Legion convention. There are all sorts of Jews. I admit that. But to say that this is responsible for anti-Semitism is to be anti-Semitic. Because the relationship between the misbehavior of Jews and the villainy of anti-Semitism is altogether incommensurate. That's the most important thing to learn. We're not responsible for anti-Semitism.
May I tell a joke at this point? I was once upon a time present at an Irish Republican Army meeting, and somebody got up and said, literally, here in New York, and somebody got up and said, "How can you, to the Irish Republican Army chap, how can you come to this country to collect money to foment rebellion against a friendly power, to wit, Great Britain?" The gentleman was speaking in rather an English voice, at which point 2 Irish Republican green-shirted gentlemen carried him up the aisle while the speaker said nothing, and then he said, "Are there any further questions?" I will now recognize the next question. All the way back there on the my right. The lady.
I was quite disturbed to hear that we're losing so many Jews through intermarriage. And I was wondering, we're all pressing for the right to live where we want to live, in the suburbs, wherever we want to live. The population is becoming very mixed. We aren't living in ghettos anymore. How can we still keep our young people from marrying out of their faith and do this, which would be part of our civil rights, not to live in ghettos.
Did you follow that, Ms.? Well, I did happen to hear it from this position. I think what the young lady was essentially asking was, presuming that our battle for civil rights has been the battle to get us out of the ghetto and to live within intermingled situations as in many of the suburbs, isn't this, our very fight for civil equality, helping the trend, if there is a trend, towards intermarriage? Did I understand you correctly? Helping the trend towards intermarriage.
And how can we achieve this? And how can we achieve this because we don't want to live in ghettos and still prevent intermarriage?
You are posing the essential question of our time. It has to do with a question that Rabbi Hertzberg raised, and which I didn't want to go into because it's a very difficult, complicated question. He raised the question, by implication, that Jewish humanism is no substitute for, let me call it Jewish fundamentalism, and that to talk about Jewishness being a very fine and noble thing is not adequate, doesn't represent the same perpetuating or driving force as the Jewish belief in Torah and Moshe LeSinai. Now, it's the same question in another form that you're asking. We are in a modern world. We are not living anymore in Jewish groups, isolated or insulated from the outside world. We're not speaking a funny English, turning it into a Yiddish, as we did with the German language, turning it into a very rich language of our own. We don't speak a Judeo-Spanish or Ladino or a Judeo-Persian. We speak English like everybody else. In fact, most of us speak a better English than the average American. We dress like them. We participate in American life. And we want to. We don't want to be segregated from our neighbors. How does that go with what in the past was perpetuated by our isolation? Well, that is the problem of modern Jewry, and my answer is that we have today an agency in Jewish life which our forefathers did not have. They were the colonies of a land which didn't exist. Jewish life consisted of colonies. The ghettos, voluntary or involuntary, were colonies. So Dubnoff would call them. But there was no homeland. Today we are not colonies, but there is a homeland. Between that and the peculiar ethic that we find informing the whole of Jewish history, a reawakened love of Jewish content, between that and the impulse which is manifesting itself today among hundreds of thousands of Jews, we find a substitute or a parallel for what there was in the past. You ask about intermarriage. Now, I mentioned before, Rabbi Hertzberg agreed with me, there were apostates in the Middle Ages, there were defections in groups and in individuals, and we'll always have them. As long as you can get audiences like this, and I see them all over the country, you get the feeling, although you can't put it into statistics, that there is life in the Jewish group. You are posing a problem which is genuine, but don't let the formulation of it lead you to a negative or to a pessimistic answer. We have this problem, a problem of Jewish education, the problem of counteraction against the diffusive tendencies in Jewish life, but it's a problem and not a riddle. It's something to be faced and not something to wring your hands over. Rabbi, if all the questions are going to be so fundamental, there won't be many of them. Well, take over, will you?
And the gentleman in the center.
Mr. Samuel, if you feel that we have an awakening of the spirit of Judaism, do you feel that this will be upon a religious level or will it remain on the cultural and national level?
Well, I'm told this is the last question, and it's a very good one, because it's representative, and it's also one that I've brooded over a great deal, whether it be the cultural or the religious level. I don't know whether we of today really know what people once meant by the religious level. We say that they believed that actually a group of Jews stood at the foot of a mountain, and there was thunder and lightning, and the voice was heard, and with a single utterance it issued the 10 Commandments. That is the religious feeling. Now the question that I ask, and I ask it naturally as a modern, did the religious feeling spring from that belief, or was it the belief that created the religious feeling? My view is that one can be profoundly religious without these fundamentalist attitudes. That one can have a sense of the significance, the validity of those beliefs for those times, with respect and love and inspiration drawn from them, without accepting them literally. If I think of my parents, my grandparents, how different they were from me. Yiddish speaking, not tremendously Orthodox, but very warmly, deeply Jewish. I couldn't tell them how I feel about Jewish life unless I spoke their language. And yet I feel myself completely at one with them. I don't feel any difference between them and me, although they would think that I'm completely different. I'll give you an instance. When I went to Cheder, I was very much of a Shegitz. In fact, until 18 or 19, I didn't want to be a Jew at all. And I was an atheist, a socialist, an anarchist, a positivist, or whatever they called it in those days. Was in der Kort. And my Rebbe foretold of me that I would precipitate a great downgoing of the entire Jewish people, together with a contingent of Goyim as well. And then, this was in Manchester, England. I left Manchester in 1914 and came to America. My Rebbe went to settle in Sfat, Safad. I didn't see him again until 1929. And at that time, just at the time of the riots, you remember the riots of 1929? I went with Colonel Kish, who was then the chairman of the Jewish Agency in Palestine, 2 days after the riots, namely August 25, 1929. I went on a tour of the colonies. And I remember that my old Rebbe had settled in Safed, and I said to Colonel Kish, will you give me 10 minutes to look him up? He said, yes. I wanted to send news of him, whether he had survived or not, to the family in England. So I found him, knocked at the door, and he came out, and he'd become as white as a dove. And I'd put on my American uniform to make those rounds. I thought maybe I'd intimidate the Arabs. And the Rebbe came out, and I said to him, Rebbe, eincha makir oti? Don't you recognize me? I said it in Hebrew. And he looked at me, his eyes filled with tears, and he said, Moshe, redst ake loshen kodesh aber fort wie a goy. I spoke Hebrew. I spoke Hebrew with a Sephardic accent, and that to him was completely goyish. Now, I felt completely at one with him. He didn't feel completely at one with me. I ask myself sometimes, what would the Rambam have said if they had told him of an East European Jewry 800 years after him, which would speak a language of the northern barbarians, Yiddish, with some Hebrew words chopped in, and that this language would be beautifully Jewish. It would have the nuances, the warmth, and the passion of the Jewish religion, and that he would be studied by people speaking Yiddish. Well, he wouldn't understand. They would feel at one with him, but he wouldn't have felt at one with them. Now, of the fundamentalists, I feel at one with them. I can't share their views, but I feel at one with them. They don't understand me, but I think I understand them. I am much warmer toward them than they are toward me. And in this question, coming back to the terms in which it was put, as to whether it is religious or cultural, let's say humanistic, let's not be baffled by terminology. If the feeling is there, and if the continuity of will to do these things is there, the language in which that will and that longing express themselves can vary to an enormous extent, and yet we have fundamentally the same phenomenon. The changes that Judaism has undergone, we think of it as the desert product of Bedouins. We think of it as the Jewishness of the time of the judges, the time of Solomon, then the time of the rabbis, the Prushim, the Middle Ages, modern times. There have been enormous changes, and yet there is this continuity. And this is what impresses me, and the longing that I find among Jews to adhere to this and become part of it is in itself an expression of my belief that it still has a very long history in front of it.
About 2 months ago, I was on a platform where the chairman was not in complete agreement with me. And at this point in the evening, he found himself completely free to deliver a 20-minute rebuttal. I didn't like it one hoot in Hades. And from this I learned that if ever I were in that delicious spot where I could deliver the rebuttal, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it even with the impunity of being able as chairman not to allow Sir rebuttal. Let me say, all kibitzing aside, that there is, of course, in all of these discussions, not merely a difference in fact. I think that particular comment, we can, no, okay. Thank you. I would like to thank Mr. Samuel for what he has said. I am quite conscious of the fact that he says it from a wealth of experience and a wealth of dedication. And now it being 10 o'clock, we are not going to engage in any further discussion as to who came to listen to whom. We'll all go get some coffee.
Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to assure you that this is not a gag. I think that you all join with me in thanking Mr. Samuels and Rabbi Hertzberg for doing an outstanding job. And we'll prove it to Dr. Hertzberg when on November the 30th, ladies and gentlemen, we will welcome Mr. Label Katz, the president of B'nai B'rith. Until then, thank you, Dr. Kolodny, for choosing B'nai B'rith as the first organization to share this omnibus series with you. And until November 30th, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much and good night.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.